Hello everyone, welcome to a brand new chess video. Make sure to save this video because it's going to become one of your favorites on the entire YouTube platform. I'm going to teach you how to play the French defense in all of its different variations. In other words, by the time you finish watching this video, you'll be fully prepared to start playing the French defense, and they won't be able to surprise you with any variation. Okay? So, what is the French defense, chess teacher? It's as simple as this. When they play the king's pawn to e4, we're going to play e6. For those of you who have no idea what the French defense is, it's very simple. We don't occupy the center directly because we're preparing with an e6 first to then play d5. Here, everyone plays d4. Why? Because they take advantage of the fact that we haven't occupied the center to occupy it themselves with their two pawns, right? And that is the correct way to continue. Whenever they don't occupy the center, placing their two pawns completely centralized. Notice how both of their bishops develop well, and their two knights also have a wonderful position. And here, we are going to play d5. Up to this point, we have the French defense. It really is just as simple as that. But here, there are four different main variations that we're going to narrow everything down to three. And I'm going to explain them to you in such a simple way that you'll be able to play them without any kind of problem, without having studied entire books on the French defense, just by watching this video. So if we reach 300 likes on this video, I'll make the same video with the defense or opening that you prefer, and leave for me in the comments. So let's get to it. What options does white have here? Well, first I'll explain it to you. I'll explain what options they have, then we'll detail them one by one. The main one, and the one they play against you almost always, is this one here. The advanced variation. They play e5 against us, okay? Why? Because here they're left with a lot of space, and we're left with much less. Now I'm going to show you how to counterattack and how to play against that, because we have some spectacular plans. The other variation would simply be the exchange variation. What happens if they capture this pawn here, and how do we have to play? And finally, the Tarrasch variation, or the knight c3 and knight d2 variation, which really doesn't matter to us because we're going to play the same way, and it's very simple. So come on, let's get to the rodeo, put your boots on, because we're going to start directly with the advanced variation. Perhaps the most played variation. Mind you, you shouldn't overlook any of the variations, because if you study one more than the other, they might play the other variation and you'll end up worse off, okay? Very well. The most popular one, the advanced variation. What are we going to do when they play this advance here? Well, our plan, most of you should know it, but if not, I'll explain it. It's very simple. It's to fight against this pawn here, okay? This d4 pawn is white's main favorite because it's the one holding the position together. Look closely. If this pawn disappears, look at the weakness they have here. We'd probably end up winning it, right? So we'll just start with c5 whenever they play the advanced variation against us. Right here, they only have one good move, and that move is c3, defending this point. If they defend it with another piece, like the knight for example, then simply pawn takes pawn would give us a pretty significant advantage, since now this pawn will be very hard to defend, and we'll have a massive initiative to attack with our knights, even through here and here with the queen. They'll almost never be able to defend it without weakening themselves a lot with this pawn, okay? So they only have one good move here when we make the move c5, which is c3. Everything's correct so far. How should we continue? Well, we'll just continue with knight c6, with the main theme of the French defense, advanced variation. Remember well, attack this point right here. We're putting pressure on this point. Perfect. Our opponent's going to play the good one, logically, which is knight f3. It develops the knight and defends the d4 point. Like I said, don't worry if they don't play this against Jeff. I'm giving you the best variation for white because from here, if you use this plan, with an inferior variation for white, you'll be even better off, right? So don't worry. Very well, knight f3. And then here we're just gonna play knight e7, and I'll explain why. If some smart aleck tries to defend this point with f4, then you'll play knight h6. It's an ideal plan. Why? Because now this bishop can't trade for this knight, and therefore we won't have to double our pawns. And besides, this knight will have a spectacular square on f5, and will hit this d4 point, which is what we want, remember? However, we're only going to do this if they play f4. Notice that if they play the normal move knight f3, we'll bring out this g knight through e7. Why? Because if we bring it out here, they trade and we double our pawns. Instead, from here, it's already aiming at the 5 square again to come and attack this point. Pay close attention because you must understand something very important whenever they play the advanced variation. We have a good bishop and a bad bishop, okay? This bishop is the bad one. Why? Simply because it's bumping into our own pawn structure. This bishop is good, even though it seems like it doesn't have many possible developments. However, you're gonna see, next, that this bishop will be very useful in the opening. Mind you, it's important to develop this knight first, because if we develop the bishop first, look closely, this knight can't get out here, or here, because the bishop is in the way. So it's very important to first bring this knight out to e7, okay? Very well, our opponent can follow up with many ideas. They can develop this bishop, which is the most normal thing to do to be able to castle quickly, right? Simply, if they play, for example, bishop d3, which isn't the one I'm going to recommend, what should you do? Well, just pawn takes pawn, and start putting pressure on this d4 square. I'm telling you, it's going to be a real headache for your opponents to defend this square, all right? Let's assume then that here, instead of placing the bishop blocking the queen's defense, he puts it on e2, maybe a slightly more precise move. In that case, we're simply going to do the same thing. We're going to capture. You see, it's very simple to play if you understand the concepts well. I'm going to put all my effort into explaining it in a way that all of you can understand it the first time. And even if it's not the first time, just by watching this video as many times as you need, you'll be able to play it perfectly. Perfect. We trade these pawns when they develop the bishop. Remember that well, okay? First we develop the knights and then we trade here. With what idea? Well, simply knight f5. Notice that we're doing the same thing all the time. For now, notice one thing. We're attacking this pawn with 2 pieces and they're defending it with 2. In other words, for now they shouldn't bury. If they simply play a move here like castling, what we're going to do is keep pressing this square with queen b6. And as you can see, all the moves here are already starting to be dangerous for white. Notice that either they play perfectly, this is the good thing about this defense, either they play perfectly or our pressure will be brutal. Here we already have a fairly significant advantage. Now we're attacking this square with 3 pieces, and there's no satisfactory way to defend this square, because surely you're all seeing that the only way to defend the d4 square is bishop e3, and bishop e3 has a serious problem. It's giving up a pawn. Which pawn is it giving out? This pawn on b2. As you can see, it's giving up this pawn. He should develop this knight. We keep attacking this square. That is, here, after the move queen b6, we're attacking this d4 square too much, and things are getting too complicated for the white pieces. In other words, let's take one move back. When we play moving our knight to the f5 square, they really have to be precise, all right? They can't just play simply castling their king or something that doesn't make any sense, because then we'll simply play bringing our queen out to b6, and we're going to gobble up that pawn on the d4 square. And I'll tell you one thing, once you gobble up this pawn, which you'll manage in many of your games, what's going to happen? Not only will you have an extra pawn, but you're going to blow your opponent's entire position wide open. Because now this pawn, which is very well supported, would stop being so well supported, and the position will be so easy for you to play that you'll achieve great success. Now then, what move should they make instead of castling? Well, they have several moves here. The main and best one is knight c3, and I'm going to explain why. The good thing about this defense is that they must find the precise moves, as I'm telling you. Now, when we use the move queen to b6 to keep attacking, you'll tell me, look, chess teacher, we're in the same spot as before. This pawn is being attacked by 3 pieces, and it's not easy to defend either. In fact, the only move they have is bishop to e3, and the exact same thing would happen again. It could even exchange knight for bishop, and queen for b2, winning a pawn once again. However, they shouldn't play bishop to e3 here. Instead, knight to c3 was to make the move knight to a4 the only move that saves it for white. Notice that it's already complicated, huh? King to f1 would also save it to avoid some possible checks later on. However, I doubt they'll use king to f1 in your games, okay? since he'd be losing the castle, and if your opponent is very, very good, he might play it. In fact, if your opponent is very, very good, you can rest easy because surely, whether he makes this move or another, he'll definitely pressure you. Okay? The correct move here, and the most used one, is knight to a4. Why? Because we're still attacking this point with three pieces. However, they're attacking our queen, so we have to prioritize defending the queen. What are we gonna do? We're simply gonna deliver a check. Oh, queen to a5. Check. Watch out as we're attacking with this check. The queen has already moved out of the pin. Well, not the pin, the threat. Sorry. And now they have to block the check, right? If, for example, they play bishop to d2, we'd simply come in with our bishop. And notice that after the exchanges, because otherwise we were gonna exchange and end up capturing this pawn here. Look closely. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen. And it doesn't matter if knight takes queen or king takes queen, this pawn would be totally defenseless. Therefore, it's normal for them to exchange. Once they exchange, we're simply going to capture with the queen, check, and then we're going to capture this pawn here or this pawn here. So notice that it seems bishop to d2 doesn't work to block the check, and it's a move that seems super interesting. Also, look closely here that if we do bishop takes and queen takes, they're also leaving this knight here. So final summary, if we play queen to a5, the only move they have possible is knight to c3, going back with the knight. Very well then, what should we do if they make the good move and go back with the knight? Well, very simple. We'll go back queen to b6 and we'd have this attack here. If you see they're being annoying, trying to do the same thing again, you have two options. Either look for a draw. If your opponent is superior, then you repeat moves here and you'll have a draw. Or try to be a little more aggressive. And what's the more aggressive variation? Well, instead of moving the queen away to give a check, come and give a check directly with the bishop. With what result? Now, simply, when they block, which they can do now, we're going to play queen to a5 because we have to move the queen away. Remember well, huh? They're attacking our queen. One thing is giving checks and the other is giving away the queen, right? Very well. We move it away, put pressure here. When he castles or whatever they do, simply bishop takes, and after knight takes, queen takes. If he plays queen takes, we exchange queens, and if he plays knight takes, we eat here. In both variations, we're going to end up with an extra pawn. Conclusion of this advanced variation, very, very simple. As you've been able to see, our idea is to bring our pieces in to pressure the d4 point. Also, I've shown you how to play if your opponent makes the best maneuvers. Now, you're going to be really happy because the first variation I showed you, which is the advanced variation, is perhaps the one with the most theory and maybe the hardest to understand, though I think I'd explained it simply so you can all understand and use it in your games. We have two variations left, the exchange variation and the knight variation. If they play either of these two variations against you, you can be quite calm. Just like the advance, you can also be calm if you know it. This one even more so, because we'll simply recapture with the pawn, and attacking ideas are very difficult for the white pieces. Usually, those who play the exchange variation play correctly, knight f3, to which will respond symmetrically with knight f6, bishop d3, to which will also respond symmetrically with bishop d6. Why do they play bishop d3? It's very simple, right? Bishop e2 would also be possible. However, this bishop doesn't do much over here. Instead, from here it points toward a possible castling. In fact, it can't come here or here because we'd simply play c6 and this bishop would have to retreat, giving us a free tempo. That's why I don't dwell too much on this bishop d3. Simply bishop d6 for the same reason, right? It's the best position for this light squared bishop for white and the dark squared one for us. Alright, here simply, how can the game continue? Well, with castling, right? If your opponent tries to play c4 first, I recommend you capture this pawn and play against this isolated pawn. You should know that whenever there's a double queen's pawn, even though the French defense is a king pawn opening, in the exchange variation, it transforms into a queen's pawn variation. You can already see it's a double queen's pawn. Well, whenever you have a double queen's pawn variation, the c pawn itself is responsible for unbalancing this double central pawn position, right? So when they push c4, now I'm going to tell you how you should play with pawn takes pawn, okay? Very simple. If they don't play c4, well, they can't cause you any problems because look, it's the only problem they can pose in this situation. All right, if they castle first, you castle, you just keep biding your time, right? And when they push d4, pawn takes pawn. All right, why pawn takes pawn if it seems like we improve this bishop, leaving them with a central pawn while we don't have one? Excuse me? Because now we're going to pose serious problems for our opponent. First, this isn't a very well known variation, and we're throwing our opponent completely off their game because they don't expect us to give up our central pawn for a side pawn. However, playing against an isolated pawn is very comfortable. For example, knight c6 attacking this pawn. And many of you will say, now look, chess teacher, this move seems a bit weak. We are letting this pawn advance under some very good conditions. However, this doesn't bother us because we have good retreats for the knight. Knight to a5 in this case, attacking this bishop, which if it moves here, we would simply trade it, and on top of that, we'd be much better in the position since we'd have a good bishop pair. Very well, so this bishop must retreat. Not here, because it would lose the pawn, so it must go to e2. And then we have a rather surprising move here, which is knight takes pawn. Notice that this was very simple, right? If you didn't understand it, rewind the video. I don't want it to get too long. Why can we give away this knight? Very simple. Now, this knight cannot be taken because bishop takes would follow with a discovered attack check, and we'd gobble up the queen. And that is exactly the reason why we can capture this pawn here without having to worry about any kind of problems at all. And here we would already be up a pawn. Notice that they couldn't advance this pawn here. Why am I telling you this? Because notice that here they almost never expect us to capture this pawn, bishop takes, and play against this isolated pawn. And when we attack here, truly many people will make this advancing move, which is a slight mistake thanks to knight to a5 attacking the bishop and later being able to sacrifice this knight for a pawn, though we're not really sacrificing anything because this knight is untouchable. But what if they don't advance this pawn and keep playing in a totally normal and calm way, like knight to c3? Well, you shouldn't worry at all because here we have a super good position to play. Notice that we have material equality, however, our opponent has an isolated pawn, which is always a target for attack. Therefore, you'll have a super comfortable game. For example, if you don't want any kind of trouble, you play h6, and this bishop can no longer go anywhere important. For instance, it can only come here. Then you develop your bishop, and you're going to play an extremely comfortable game, where you can fight against this pawn here thanks to the pressure from your pieces. So you'll also wish for them to play this variation against you. Truly, when this video ends and you've studied it thoroughly, you'll really want to play the French defense because you'll control all of the opponent's responses and you'll like them all. And now we're just left with the last variation, which is the knight variation, both knight to c3 and knight to d2. I told you it was exactly the same because we were going to do pawn takes pawn, okay? Now, what does it matter if the knight is here or here? It must recapture this pawn, and we would reach the same position. Take a good look. The great thing about this video is that by simply mastering these three variations, you can play the French defense forever. From here, if you want, you can even expand your knowledge and study even more, right? But if you just study these three variations well with this video, believe me, that you'll play the French defense at a very high level, which is a defense that gives spectacular results, even in slow game tournaments. All right, very well. What are we going to play here? Well, we simply develop with bishop to e7. Don't worry, this variation is very simple to play, and you're going to love it. We develop this bishop to e7, they continue developing their pieces, knight to f3, we play knight to f6. Here they have two options, okay? They can trade or they can let us trade. If they trade, that's great. Why? Because this bishop on f6 will become a real attacking machine, right? This bishop here defends the castle and points toward the queen side. In the future, if we're worried, we can always pull the bishop back here for a super strong castle. And the other option is they just keep developing with bishop d3, defending this knight, and then we'll capture, okay? In both cases, don't worry. Just like the first variation is more theoretical and you need to know the book moves, these two variations, like the exchange or the two knights, it doesn't matter where they go. They're more about understanding the concepts, which are quite simple if you get them. In this case, if you understand the opening better than your opponent, you'll likely end up winning the game. We castle calmly, it doesn't really matter because, because what's our plan? Well, look, knight d7, much better than knight c6. Let me explain why. If you don't understand this plan, you'll probably ask, why knight d7? No, it's very simple. We just want to reposition it here, where this knight will be much better, and will be eyeing the center. You know, this knight here is the best defender of the castle, and on top of that, we gain the initiative. Knight d7, I don't know, say rook e1, for example, and knight f6. Very important. We attack this bishop, which has to retreat. Now, we just need to develop this bishop. And look, many of you might say, okay, bishop d7, but b6 is even better because we want to develop the bishop this way. And look at what a wonderful position this is. This fianchettoed bishop is spectacular. This bishop is very solid. We have very solid pieces, we won't hang anything, and they're very well placed. b6, our opponent, for example, can play c3, a very good move to support this d4 point, which, as you know, can become very weak sometimes, as we've seen before, bishop b6. And here, for example, queen c2 attacking here would be a mistake because with the bishop on b6, we could always open up the king. So here they should be a bit more careful and instead of queen c2, for example, play bishop f4. How are we going to continue? Well, the plan from here on is very simple, right? The bishop, although it's blocked here, we could even come in through here, attacking with great force. The bishop here remains even more passive. It attacks absolutely nothing here because this pin is defended by the bishop on d7. We can even attack this bishop and we don't mind. So the strongest move is bishop f4. And here we're simply gonna exchange these bishops. If it retreats, it'll lose the tempo because now we're attacking over here. c5, queen c7, we put on a lot of pressure. Attacking here, okay? So the normal thing here is for them to capture the bishop, obviously. And here you have two options, capture with the queen or capture with the pawn. I recommend the queen because this pawn can always come to c5 to attack heavily. And notice that this is a fairly solid position. To understand, as I've said, you shouldn't memorize moves here, just the first view, but above all, the ideas. We're going to continue with a real game so you can see how this type of opening can proceed. This is very important because this way you'll have a real example of how to play in your games, right? For example, here white played knight e5, greatly improving this knight. And as I was just telling you, c5 is a fundamental move. Why? Because it develops, well, not develops, it tightens the center, with this c pawn, so important, as I always tell you, to act against this pawn right here. Right now, pawn takes pawn is being threatened, and surely, although right now it wouldn't work, look closely, okay? Pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn would be a mistake, because simply bishop takes h7 check would come, a discovered attack, and we'd lose the queen. Simply at pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn, we wouldn't take here, okay? We'd play another type of thing, like for example, moving the king away or something like that, and this pawn would be isolated. That's why they capture here. Once they capture, here the player with the black pieces, instead of recapturing, played queen e5. Queen e5, a great move because it prepares to recapture whenever it wants, but also threatens checkmate. That's why they have to be super alert. White played queen f3, and black simply, what they did was ruin the opponent's pawn structure. How? Queen takes queen, knight takes, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. And now what they've done after these changes is ruin and play with the solidity of our pawn structure. You know that recently, I think it was 2 days ago, I posted a video that I recommend 100% if you want to improve your chess level about how to play your pawn structure well and how this will give you many victories. And the game ended quickly. Pawn takes pawn. If you want, finish watching this game and go watch the other video I'm going to leave in the description. No, white attacked the rook. Look closely at what way it went. And presses on the b file, it simply has to play b3. Instead of capturing this bishop, which would fix the file, the opponent's pawn structure, it plays knight h4. Why? Because he wants to look for knight h5, because he wants to look for knight f4 and improve the position of this knight, which can still become stronger and stronger. Rook d1, rook d8, facing rooks on open files, c4. I'm going through this faster because it's not important. 5, pressing this bishop, which has to move, and now, yes, knight f4, and black has a pretty comfortable game. They're going to improve their kings, okay? Notice that both of them maneuver. He has to try to do something, right? For example, here he first played this, although it's indifferent because after the exchanges, he delivered this check, this white king has to move. And now look closely at how black comes in to apply pressure. This position is totally won. And whatever white does, look, here he stops every possible counterattack. He comes to exchange here, and it's clear that this position is too easy to squeeze for the black pieces. Look, check on g2, the king has to go to dark squares because that way it doesn't bother the bishop, and the black king penetrates like no other. And this position is completely won. Once you have the opponent's pieces tied up, you use your pieces to go and win the pawns. Notice that here, this pawn is going to be won no matter how much he comes to defend. Why? Because the king was in charge of defending this bishop as well. And this is a completely winning pawn endgame for black. Why? Because the king is much more active. I won't focus on it more. Take a good look, okay? I'll go through it quickly, as black simply manages to win with great ease here. White will never be able to promote a pawn, not even close, right? Look at how much they have left. And black would manage to promote much sooner. So I hope you loved this video on the French defense. If you've made it to the end, please, I'm asking you, leave a like, it costs nothing, and share it with your friends so you can be the best players and help each other out. This defense is one of my favorite defenses. I hope I explained it wonderfully so that everyone understood me, and I hope you put it into practice. See you tomorrow, friends, and another new video. Bye bye.